If you want an amazing example of how a worker should be dedicated to his responsibilities, you only have to look at Yaakov Avinu. But in the analysis of what we learn from Yaakov about the obligation that a worker has to his employer, you're going to see some distinction between the way the Rambam and the way the Alter Rebbe phrase it. Seif Hilchis Schirus, at the end of the halachas of hiring and employing people, Paskin the Rambam rules as follows. In the same way as the employer is warned not to shortchange or undercut the salary of his employee, and not to delay salaries, likewise the employee is required not to steal time that he owes to his employer. To take off a little bit of time here, a little bit of time there, check his social media, whatever it is. We don't want a situation where he's going to essentially void the day in a dishonest way. But the employee has to be very scrupulous about the time that he spends on his job. Likewise, person also has to work with all of their abilities, all of their energy. How do we learn it? Because Yaakov Avinu, the great tzaddik, said, he told Rachel and Leah, I worked for your father with all of my might. Because he did so, he got the reward for it even in this world, not only some spiritual reward. Where do we see it? As the pasuk says, that he literally burst forth with success. He had this incredible abundance. Now, the Alter Rebbe quotes the same halacha, but as we'll see, there are slight differences between the way the Alter Rebbe says it and the way that the Rambam said it. Let's see the Alter Rebbe. Same concept, just like the employer cannot steal from or delay the salary of his employee. Likewise, the employee has to make sure not to steal from his employer, and that he'll take a bit of time here, a bit of time there, and effectively be dishonest through the course of the day. And he has to be very scrupulous with himself with regards to timekeeping. And the person has to also work with all of his might, all of his energy. As Yaakov Avinu said, that with all of my might I served your father, and that's why he got reward also in this world, that he was incredibly successful. Now, at first glance, it would appear as the Alter Rebbe is it looks like the Alter Rebbe is basically quoting the Rambam with a few differences here and there. But when you really examine this, we're going to see that there's a fundamental difference between the way that the Alter Rebbe in his Shulchan Aruch presents this halacha compared to how the Rambam does. After telling the story about Yaakov Avinu, the Alter Rebbe continues as follows. For this reason, because you have to work with all of your might and you're not allowed to take off time, etc., therefore, the employee is not allowed to take on another job at night, or to hire himself out during the day. And likewise, so you can't work at night and then hire yourself out during the day. You can't use your animal at night and hire it out during the course of the day. Nor can an employee starve or in any other way undermine his health, because that will weaken his strength. And he will be unable to do the work that his employer requires with strength. Now, all these halachas that we've just seen in the Alter Rebbe about the fact that you can't have a side job or weaken yourself if you're responsible to your employer, are also quoted in the Rambam, but here's where we're going to begin to see the major difference between the Rambam and the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. The difference is that the Rambam quotes those details before the details of working for your employer, not taking off time, etc. Before telling us that just as there's a responsibility of employer to employee, there's a responsibility back. So why is that? So we're going to try a simple explanation, which is, if you understand the difference between what the Rambam wants to achieve in Mishnah Torah versus the Alter Rebbe in his Shulchan Aruch, maybe that explains it. As der Shino is nicht ein Shino betoichen. It's not a fundamental thematic difference between the two opinions or the two sources. No, it's just presenting the same halachas in a different order. And the reason why they would be presented in different orders is because of the purpose of each of these two books, the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch and the Rambam's Mishnah Torah. So what is the difference between these two Sfarim? The Rambam had Geshim Sifroi Halachas Halachis. The Rambam says clearly that his Mishnah Torah is just a book of the actual laws themselves, without going into the background or the reasons, motivations behind those halachas. Whereas the Alter Rebbe specifically wanted his Shulchan Aruch to include not just the halacha, but also the parameters of the halacha and the reasons behind the halacha, etc. On the Rebbe, for that reason, the Alter Rebbe the Alter Rebbe will always present halachas in such a way that helps you to understand why this is the halacha and what the parameters of the halacha are. That's why he puts all of the laws relating to employee responsibilities in a single paragraph, after giving us the general introduction which defines the parameters of these laws, for all of these laws, which is that just as an employer has a responsibility to his employee to treat him appropriately, likewise, in reverse, the employee to the employer. In other words, the overarching principle is an employer has a responsibility to work properly for his boss. And then, once he's given us that introduction, then the Alter Rebbe first says a broad warning and responsibility, which is the that the employer should be very scrupulous about time, and should work with his full abilities. And then the Alter Rebbe describes a secondary halacha which derives from that, which is once we've determined that you have to be dedicated to the time slots of your work hours, then you could say, you cannot have another job at night. That might take away from your ability to work during the day. That's because the Alter Rebbe is giving us context and he wants us to understand what this law is all about. Whereas the Rambam doesn't need us to understand why the halacha is this way. He just wants you to know practically what the halachas are. And so the Rambam presents these halachas in the order of how they would happen during the course of a day. So he's going to start with the things that happen before you get to work. That the night before you go to work, you can't have another job because it's going to diminish your ability to work. And then he can get into the details of what an employee may or may not do while during work hours. He has to watch the clock properly, and he has to work with his full abilities, etc. In addition, die dinim ein apoel shaykhule seine hemshech zu dinyonim mirmer lecheir vel apoel megieton was der Rambam sagt for them. Now, there's also other context over here, and that is that the Rambam did illustrate that there's certain things that a worker could do that might feel like they're a little bit dishonest, but they're actually acceptable. Or that they're allowed to dip their bread into the tzir, which is like the juice almost of fish, etc. So he says certain things that you're allowed to do that you might think you're taking advantage of the employer, but it's acceptable. And then he says, and these things you may not do. So he's following chronology. And maybe that's the difference between the Alter Rebbe and the Rambam. The Alter Rebbe needs us to understand the context of the halacha, and the Rambam is just telling us how the halachas play out as you would encounter them. It's a good explanation, but it's not good enough. Von dem, was der Rambam hebt on die letzte halacha mit der Hagdama. The fact that the Rambam starts the second, because remember he divided it into two halachas. The first halacha was about the things that an employee may not do after hours, and then the halacha about things that he may not do or has to do during work hours. So the second part, he gives an introduction. That just like the employer may not steal from the salary of his employee, so the employee has to be careful not to steal from the work that he's supposed to be doing for his boss. Funny place to put in an introduction. Was der Rambam hat schon klar gesagt in der Friedrich Halacha nicht sein Gesam Lachtisch Balabais. In the previous halacha, the Rambam already said clearly you cannot do something which is going to steal away from the work that you're doing for the balabas. That's why you can't have a second job after hours. The fact that he's giving another introduction here implies, as das ist nicht nur ahisofa mitzad in dem zman u'maiseh ha'isur, this next piece of information in the second halacha is not further information that just applies at a different time during work hours as opposed to the previous halacha, which was after hours. But it's two different sets of halacha. There's one set of halacha which is represented by the behavior of an employee after hours, and there's another kind of halacha which is represented by the behavior of the employee during work hours. What does that mean? Das heißt, Leuten alten Rebbe, from the perspective of the Alter Rebbe, where the Alter Rebbe puts them all into one paragraph, and in what order? First, he tells us that the worker has to work with everything he's got. And then he says, and so you cannot take off time or do another job. That's why an employee may not have a second job after hours. So the Alter Rebbe is framing it clearly. Your responsibility as a worker is work with all of your ability. And therefore, don't do these other side things. Whereas according to the Rambam, the Rambam said that you may not have an after-hours job in a separate halacha before getting into the conversation of koichoi, of giving your all to your job. It's a different law, it's a different restriction. The concept, just by the way, that the way the Alter Rebbe frames it, that the main thing is you have to be completely dedicated to your work, and therefore you can't take off time and you can't have an after-hours job, etc. The Alter Rebbe didn't make that up. Was men learned up from Yaakov, this principle that we learn from Yaakov, that you have to serve your master with your boss with everything you got, is mafarish and smag. That is quoted in the Sefer Mitzvahs Gadol, so the Alter Rebbe has a source. But what we need to understand, so you have two philosophies over here about the work and responsibilities of an employee. The Rambam that says there are two groups of responsibilities, and the Alter Rebbe says it's all one category of working with everything you got. So we need to understand what's the logic behind these two opinions. If you take the Alter Rebbe's position where it's all about that you have to work with all of your might, and therefore you can't do other things. Or if you take the Rambam's view, that there is a halacha that you've got to work with all your abilities, and there's a separate halacha which is don't do other things which distract. So to get there, we're going to go look at the Rambam and pick out 4 things that the Rambam says that actually are surprising. And we saw that the Rambam bases the principle that you have to be a good worker learned on the story of Yaakov Avinu. Here's the words of the Rambam. You're also required to serve or to work with all of your koyach. Because Yaakov HaTzadik said that I served your father with all of my koyach. Therefore he got reward for it even in this world, and he quotes the pasuk that it became extremely, extremely successful. 4 issues in that paragraph that don't seem to make sense. The following things don't seem to be clear. Number 1, Aleph. The Rambam is sefer von halachos. We've already illustrated that the Rambam's interest is telling us the halacha. That's not the history behind the halacha. So why is it relevant for us to know that Yaakov Avinu was rewarded for working b'chol koichai? You want to tell me that we learn that you have to work b'chol koichai from Yaakov, so now you have a model of what b'chol koichai looks like, what it means to be completely invested in your work? Great. Why do I have to know that he was rewarded and dafka in olam hazeh? Now this is the end of Hilchos Schiros, so maybe the Rambam's using this because he wants to end off on a positive note. Well, first of all, there are 83 different sections of halacha in Mishnah Torah, and he doesn't make sure to end every single one of them on a positive note. But besides that, it's more importantly, This expression about Yaakov Avinu being rewarded for his dedication is quoted in the Torah and Shulchan Aruch as well, but not at the end of these halachas as concluding on a positive note. And noch mehr in Shulchan Aruch Admar Sachen kommt es in mit Nasif, especially when you look back at the Alter Rebbe in his Shulchan Aruch, the reference to Yaakov Avinu being rewarded is in the middle of a paragraph. So why do we have to know that Yaakov Avinu is rewarded and in this world? Question number 2b is Nachmer, take it a step further. The fact that the Rambam tells us that Yaakov Avinu got a special reward for working so hard actually seems to contradict the whole point of what the Rambam wants to illustrate. First, he quotes the fact that you have to work for your boss with everything you've got. We learn that from Yaakov because that's what he did. That illustrates that it's obligatory for an employee to work with all his faculties. But then the Rambam says, and he was rewarded for this in this world. Surely that neutralizes, or at the very least weakens, his point. The fact that he gets a special reward implies that he did something special. If it's what he's required to do, nothing special about it. If there's nothing special about it, there should be no special reward, because that's what you're obligated to do. Rather, the Rambam is making it sound like Yaakov did something unusual, and therefore he received an unusual reward. He was rewarded also in this world. So how does the Rambam bring Yaakov into the picture without undermining what he's trying to say, which is every employee is required to work with everything he's got? Number 3, Gimel, Voseloshen Shaharei. Such an unusual expression where the Rambam's proving something with the word Shaharei, because ... He's quoting a pasuk. Why doesn't he use the typical expression for quoting a pasuk? Shenemar. Dalet, and the way he describes Yaakov Avinu is so strange. Deloshan Hatzadik. Why is he calling him Yaakov Hatzadik? When do we ever call him Yaakov Hatzadik? It's an unusual expression for the Rambam to use. What you would have expected is that the Rambam would use the term we all use, Yaakov Avinu. Not only that, this is not a technical question, it's a practical question. Again, this yet again undermines the proof that the Rambam is looking to bring. The Rambam wants you and I to know that we have to work properly and responsibly. So now you're calling Yaakov a tzaddik. Does that sound like us? It makes it sound like Yaakov is an unusually spiritual person. He's a tzaddik, and therefore he behaves in an unusually dedicated manner. How do I know that I'm supposed to do the same when I'm working? So the easiest way to attempt to answer this, which is not going to work, is that all of this detail is there because the Rambam is concerned about a question we could have, which is, we have a principle that we do not learn current halacha from incidents that happened before the Torah was given. Even bris milah, we don't have a bris because Avraham Avinu had a bris. We have a bris because the Eibusha said so at Matan Torah. So the Rambam is concerned that you might wonder, how could we learn how we as employees should conduct ourselves now, post Matan Torah, from Yaakov Avinu, which is before Matan Torah? That's why the Rambam does not use the word you would have expected, and which is typically used when you're quoting a source to say shenemar. Because you don't actually learn this halacha from Yaakov per se. It's just something that helps consolidate our belief that an employee has to be responsible. Or maybe it's just illustrating an example to us, to bring in how important it is for an employee to work properly. You know how important it is for you, Mr. Employee, to be completely dedicated to your job, because look how A, Yaakov did it, and B, it worked out well for him. So if that's what the Rambam is so concerned about, and that's why he's using all this language, because he wants to avoid a question of how could we learn something from before Matan Torah, it's not a very strong argument, because in fact it's quite a weak argument. We have many places where you find Rambam in the halachas difnei in the writings of the Rambam, including halachas in this topic, but earlier on, that there are certain halachas that we do learn from incidents that happened before the Torah was given. Including in this parasha. As the Rambam learned up the halachas, the Rambam learns, how do you know that you're not allowed to have a wedding during Chol HaMoed? Because the principle is you don't mix simchas. Chol HaMoed is a simcha of Yom Tov, a wedding is a simcha of the family. How do you know that that's the case? Shenemar, because we learn it from a story which happened before Matan Torah and in our parasha, Malish was this, where Lavan told Yaakov, okay, you want to marry Rachel, you already married Leah, first finish the week of Sheva Brachos Pesach, Ein Me'orven Simcha B'Simcha. Now you'll say, but there's a principle, which is you cannot learn from before the Torah was given. So, there are many different opinions and insights into this. But what's most obvious in our case is, we're not talking about a specific halacha that we're learning from Yaakov Avinu's story, but rather we're learning a conduct, how Yaakov conducted himself and how we should conduct ourselves. That the way an employee should work is, once you've had a conversation and you've arrived at a mutual agreement, then that kind of thing, you could certainly learn from how Yaakov Avinu conducted himself before Matan Torah. That cannot be the explanation for these four issues that we have raised in the Rambam's language. And besides that, even in our context, we find that Avodas Yaakov Lavan has learned up from Yaakov, that not only do we learn from other things in the parasha, but we learn from how Yaakov Avinu worked. The Gemara says we learn from here how much responsibility does a hired guardian have to look after somebody else's property. Ad, says the Gemara, what's the extent? A direct quotation from Yaakov Avinu. Where you have to expose yourself to the terrible heat in the day and the cold at night to look after somebody else's property. In other words, you can learn conduct from an event that happened before Matan Torah. That is not the reason the Rambam had to put these four unusual expressions in his description of Yaakov Avinu's dedication. We're back to square one. We need to answer these questions. So we'll start with the reference of, before we look at the reference. The explanation is this. The fact that the Rambam tells us, how do I know that an employee has to be so dedicated and working so hard? Because look at Yaakov Avinu, he worked with all of his energy and he was rewarded for it. At that point, the Rambam is actually defining for us what kol koichoi means, because let's be honest, that's open to interpretation. The employee might say kol koichi is X, and the employer might say kol koichi is X plus. So the Rambam gives us context. Just like the employer cannot steal the salary of his employee, Kach means equality, right? Equation. In the same way, the employee may not steal from the work he owes his boss, and take off a bit of time here and there, and cheat his way through the day. But he has to be really on top of his game and very honest with his time. And after that, the Rambam adds, likewise, he is also required to work with all of his strength. So you might read this and understand the responsibility that an employee has to be so careful with his time is nicht verbunden as I feel. Is verbunden mit. You have to be so careful with your time so you're not stealing your employer's work. But you'd think the responsibility to work with everything you got is not That's not really so much about you, the contract you have with the boss. So let's say today I'm not feeling so motivated and I'm only working at 80% capacity. Nobody's going to say that I'm stealing away work from the balabos. No, you think that that's you. That's about your own integrity. From Peil Ha'eved mit seinen Emunos. It's your own sense of self-trust. As darf sein übergegeben zu der Arbeit, bis lavet bechol koichoi. Your conscience should have you completely dedicated to your work to the extent that you put it, you're all into it. Das heißt, das nicht so mit dem Geld von Benodem lechaveroi. In other words, the part of lavet bechol koichoi, to work with everything you got, that's not so much between you and the other person, the employer, zwischen dem Poil mit dem Balabos, the worker, and his boss. Now, but this is actually a more personal thing, which is almost like your contract with Hashem. So you have your contract with your boss, and therefore you cannot take off time. You have a contract with yourself, which means a contract with the Eibishter, which is to have integrity and to work to the best of your abilities. That's what you'd think. That's why the Rambam quotes the story of Yaakov Avinu, Shari Yaakov, Tzadik Omar Ki, Bechol Koichi Ovatis Avichem. But Yaakov says, look at this. I served your father with all of my power. And therefore the Rambam says he was rewarded in an unusual way with incredible success. Now, the first time we read that, we thought, okay, we get it. This is what he's telling us. He's telling us that, look, Yaakov worked with all of his power, so we have to work with all of our abilities. And in that case, we had a question, why do we need the rest of the pasuk? But now we're going to discover that the rest of the pasuk, the fact that it gets rewarded, is part of the proof of how hard you have to work. How so? In dem wollte ich sagen, als Yaakov hatte mitmatisch gewesen, als sich gefühlt, lifnei mishul sadin. Had the Rambam only quoted the part where Yaakov says, Bechol koichi, that I worked with everything I have for your father, you could say, okay, well, Yaakov, because you're a champion, you're an unusual person. You push yourself beyond the requirements of the law. He did things that he was not required to do, like staying up all night looking after the flocks. And then, as we said before, you look at Yaakov and you say he's in a different category, and it kind of disproves the fact that we have to behave this way. And I don't know that every single worker has to have that level of dedication. No, the Kiraya is from the Hemshchalosh and the That's why the Rambam continued not only to tell us how Yaakov behaved, but what happened as a result, that he got this tremendous reward and was incredibly wealthy, which is now not just an interesting anecdote, it's the key to understanding what it means to be a dedicated worker. The ufta in them is, this quote, the value of this quote is, so it's not so much about the fact that Yaakov did what Hashem wants, and therefore the Eibishter rewarded him. And the difference between this mitzvah is that usually mitzvahs you only get rewarded in Olam Haba. And here he was privileged to get the reward also in Olam Hazeh. But the emphasis here, and we're going to come back and emphasize this again later, that it's schar zois, that it's this reward, meaning it's reward for his work. In other words, das heißt, when Lavan said to and agreed to Yaakov, you state your price and I will pay you. The net result of that was, even though Lavan's intention was to try and fool Yaakov and undercut his salary, so the Torah is attesting, because Yaakov worked with all of his koyach, his vayifreit, so in the most unlikely situation, he landed up exploding with success. He got the kind of reward that matches the kind of dedication that he showed with everything I've got. The fünfte statement, so what the Rambam is illustrating over here is the dedication that Yaakov showed to work b'chol koichoi is not just about him, the individual, stepping up in an incredible way. The employee, in this case Yaakov Avinu, holding himself to a certain standard. If it's linked to schar, payment, then it's defining your contract with the one who makes that payment, with the balabos. That's why it's not some spiritual reward because you had integrity and the Eibush is going to reward your integrity. No, the Rambam wants us to know it's physical reward from the employer because you worked for your employer. That's going to help us clarify things that we've raised about the Rambam's language that initially seemed to be unusual. The fact that he didn't say shenemar because this is a quotation from a pasuk, but rather sheharei, which introduces this as a way of thinking or understanding what's going on over here. Because, as we've just illustrated, the Rambam is not relying on the words of the pasuk alone in order to build his case and bring his proof. Primarily, the Rambam is showing his proof from the whole logical construction that he builds on the story of Yaakov, which is that he was rewarded, and in Olam Hazeh, which tells you that his dedication was not to himself and his divine responsibilities, but to his boss. And that's why Beis as Yaakov Avinu, no Yaakov Atzadik. That also explains why the Rambam does not call him by the typical name, but rather calls him a Tzaddik, because in the Rambam's language, Tzaddik has a very specific connotation. You could go right to the beginning of Mishnah Torah, at the beginning of the laws of personal conduct and character, and there the Rambam tells us, as the Torah Tzaddik, mit welchen der Rambam benutzich besifrei hayad, that the title Tzaddik, and certainly as it is used by the Rambam in his Mishnah Torah, is not talking to somebody who goes beyond the requirements of the law, but rather somebody who follows the letter of the law. Wer bringt dort in die Psukim benegea Midas v'ana Geiser, as der was geht in derech hayishori Midas Beinis, wird b'lashon hapasuk angerufen Tzaddik. As the Rambam spells out and even brings Tzaddik Psukim to illustrate it, the person who follows the middle path and does what the Torah expects of him to the letter of the law is called a Tzaddik. And a person who is strict on himself and goes beyond the letter of the law, in the Rambam's language, that's called a chassid. So by saying Yaakov had tzaddik, we're illustrating that Yaakov Avinu did not do something that was above the average. He did what every person is supposed to do. Und das sagt der Rambam, that's what the Rambam's telling us. As the Anhog von Yaakov in Lavid b'chol koichoim. Yaakov's conduct here, where he works for Lavan with his entire being, is it given for me wasn't because Yaakov is an outstanding person doing more than the requirement. And from the Gimel Avos Yaakov Avinu, not because he's Yaakov, and that's why he doesn't want to say Yaakov Avinu, because then you'll say, okay, that's why he behaved this way, because he's Yaakov Avinu. Not das the Eif and Achiv and Apoel, but rather the Rambam wants us to know this is Tzidkus, this is the straight and narrow, this is the average path, this is the behavior of an ordinary employee. It's the responsibility of every employee with regard to his work for his employer that it should be this way. So now, dem chidush go for this itself, as to this innovation, as a chiv lavid b'chol koiches verbunden nicht nur mit der klolisik nemonis from poil, because this is a big thing, that if I'm working with my full input and engagement, that it's not just simply about me holding myself to a level of integrity, not mit der melocha was tut, fall der balabayis, but rather it's part of my responsibility to my employer. That can be learned on Tvei Fanim. So now that we understand that that's what we're talking about, that we have now shifted the goalpost, that this is not just a person looking in the mirror and saying, I know that I'm a trustworthy employee, but rather that this is part of the responsibility that an employee has to his employer. There are two possible ways you could look at that. Is one way. This is actually part of what it means to work. It's part of how I work, but it's over and above the work. In other words, I have a responsibility. I sign a contract. I've got to do work from 9 to 5. This is the particular job description. Over and above that, also have a responsibility to throw myself into it fully. I have a responsibility to the employer to fill the hours and do the job. And then there's an additional responsibility to the employer to do so with enthusiasm and investment. That's the attitude of the Rambam, the perspective of the Rambam. Was telt voneinander die Halachas bescheiches gegeben Melachtes shel Balabais in zwei besondere Halachas, which explains why it is that the Rambam takes the two areas in which a person may be undercutting their employer, puts them into two separate halachas. In the first halacha, sagt die Dinim von ein Appel shalasses Melachtes beleile mit Prägas Melachtes shel Balabais shai toshash koich chovel yase b'melacha b'koich. First he says, look, you cannot moonlight over here, because then you're going to be exhausted when you come to work and you're not going to work properly. And then he gives another halacha. And that halacha has an introduction, which is that just like the employer has a responsibility, this is contractual, just like the employer has a responsibility to you not to cheat you on your salary, you have a responsibility to him not to cheat him on his hours, and you shouldn't take off time, but you have to be careful with time, and then also you have to invest in your job with everything you got. Why two halachas? Because from the perspective of the Rambam, these are two different classifications of employee responsibilities. The first responsibility is do your job properly. And in order to do that, sleep enough at night, eat well. In addition to that, there's another obligation, which is not just to do your job properly, but to do your job with a proper attention to time and, the part that's most relevant to us, completely throw yourself into it. What's the difference? The fact that I have to apply myself to my job is part of the job description. If a person is not doing their job with energy, with investment, well, then the job's not really getting done, right? We all know, we've had that experience of people who are not really working properly. The job's not really getting done. But the minute the Rambam tells us that there's also a responsibility to do your work with all your energy, now we're no longer talking about something that if it's absent, the job's actually not working. Rather, that's almost like a personal undertaking of the employee to the employer, saying, you have spelled out the nature of the job. That's the first halacha. I have to honor that. Now, I am signing up in this contract to say, I'm going to give you the best of me. Not the best of the job, the best of me. In other words, when we're talking about the required energy to do the job, we're talking about the requirement of the job. We're focused on the chefza, on the item, on the job. But the idea of working with everything you've got, that's about the person. Zwischen dem Polen und Balabais. That's the personal undertaking of the employee to his boss. In other words, the boss, if he took the same job to somebody else, the melacha element would still be the same, but that person might have different koiches. Is part of the responsibility of an employee is that you are essentially, in a way, under the authority of the balabas. That is the opinion of the Rambam. There are two separate things. There is the work and its requirements, and there is you and your requirements, and they're both part of your contractual agreement with the balabas. But the fundamental difference from the Alter Rebbe's perspective is these are not two different halachas, not two different areas of employee law. Regular work and work that you totally invested in. The Alter Rebbe puts it all into one halacha because it is all one halacha. In other words, you don't distinguish, according to the Alter Rebbe, between working and working with everything you got. The Alter Rebbe is not distinguishing over here between the fact that you are an employee and then the fact that because you're an employee, you're effectively in the jurisdiction of the balabas and you've got to give him everything you have. The Alter Rebbe's perspective is, it's all one thing. If you're working for a balabas, then it means you're working with everything you've got. Und dafür bringt der Alter Rebbe die Dinim von einer Polishai Chulei als ein Hemmschach, der Agdama, okay, derech שבעל muss Chulei, כך יעלה muss Chulei, ואת מלאכת בעל הבית Chulei, חייב ודקת לעצמי בזמן Chulei, וכי חייב להביא כל כוח Chulei, לפיכך כן הפועל רשאי Chulei. That's why the Alter Rebbe includes all these things about having a good night's sleep and not doing a side job and not starving yourself under the same category. It's all part of the fact that you have to be absolutely committed to the balabos. So the Rambam's view is there are two tiers of work. There is the contractual requirement of the job, and then there's the personal commitment of the employee. From the Alter Rebbe's perspective, it's one thing. You, as an employee, are required to serve not only the needs of the job, but to serve the capacity of your potential. With this information, we are now going to detect some subtle differences between the language of how the Alter Rebbe versus the Rambam shared the same halacha. Even though these are going to appear to be very minor distinctions, but because we know how incredibly precise the Alter Rebbe's golden language is. So if it was generally the Alter Rebbe writing something, we would delve into why did he say it this way. But especially here, because he's saying it differently to the Rambam. Must be not just language nuance, it must be that this is different messaging, and we're going to look at two areas. Aleph. In dem Seif von der Halacha, the end of the first Halacha, where the Rambam is mevored the time fundi dinim, where the Rambam explains the reason for the halachas which are that the worker cannot have a night job or starve himself, etc. Zokter, the Rambam says, you know why? Because if he does, it's then he's actually stealing away from the work that he owes his employer. How is he stealing? Because his strength is going to ebb. His headspace is going to weaken. And he won't do the work with the appropriate energy. So in this segment, the Alter Rebbe says the same thing, but a little differently. Aleph number one is Firstly, the Alter Rebbe does not say that you can't have a moonlighting job because you're going to be stealing the work of your balabas. Leaves that out completely. Base number two, and instead of saying like the Rambam says, well, if you were up late last night working, today you're not going to work properly, the Alter Rebbe changes it slightly and says, you're not going to be able to do what you should. And Gimel, thirdly, and then at the end, when the Rambam said that the problem is you're not going to do the work with energy, there the Alter Rebbe says you're not going to do the work of the balabos with energy. Why these distinctions? In the context of understanding that the Rambam and the Alter Rebbe fundamentally read the story of employee responsibilities differently, now it makes sense. The Rambam says, what's the conclusion of this type of behavior? The melacha, the work, won't be done properly. In other words, it's not really considered working for your boss if you're overtired. And therefore, the Rambam says, the minute a person takes a decision which is going to interfere with being able to work properly, now you're stealing from the balabos. Because you're not capable of being a true worker. If you're not capable of working properly, then your work is not proper work. Whereas the Alter Rebbe's perspective is, no, what's wrong over here is not that the work is not going to qualify as work, that your contract with your balabos is not going to be on it. You have responsibility, and to a certain extent, he has jurisdiction over you as an employee. In other words, so from the Alter Rebbe's perspective, the fact that you may not moonlight, the fact that you may not starve yourself, that's not because you're going to be stealing the work that you owe the balabos. That's not a gram. That's just kind of an outcome. You are not going to be in a position that you'll be able to do the work. We're not looking at the fact that you're undermining the work. When you get to work, you're not going to be functioning properly. No, the problem is you are right now breaking your contract with the balabos. You're supposed to be his. You're supposed to be dedicated to him, available to him, invested in his needs. You're now looking somewhere else. It's not a matter that tomorrow you're not going to work properly. It's the fact that you're not honoring the contract now, because in Alter Rebbe's view, it's all one halacha. That you have to be bechol koichai, completely dedicated to the balabos. The second distinction is based in the Raya von Yaakovin, is the L'shon Rambam lefichoch not al schar zois. The other difference is when the Rambam refers to the fact that we learned this from Yaakov Avinu, he says that's why Yaakov Avinu got this reward. It's an unusual expression. The Alter Rebbe aber sagt lefichoch not al scharoi. Whereas the Alter Rebbe says, therefore he got his reward, which actually, if you think about it, is an easy expression to understand. Why the distinction? Vayeitzei the Rambam, from the perspective of the Rambam, is the schar for if it's bechol koichai in noisef if schar if the etzem melocha lebalabai is, because the Rambam already distinguished that there are two layers of responsibility. You have your responsibility to the job, that's to work. Then you have your personal responsibility to invest yourself b'chol koichai. So the reward for the job is one thing, the reward for being completely dedicated is something else. The schar is taka verbunden mit guf hamloch ochnal seif sif dalet. Of course, all the reward is relative to your actual doing the work. Aber b'chol zois is das ein neuse verfetzem hamlocha. But doing your work with this incredible dedication, that is an add-on, that is an anecdote to the actual work itself. That's why the Rambam says Yaakov Avinu got that reward, not his reward. You work, you get paid. That's your reward. No, he got that reward, the reward for the extra mile, for the bechol koichai, the specialis charif avodas bechol koichai. Even though the Rambam is saying that's what you have to do, it's your obligation, but it's your second tier obligation. Whereas the Alter Rebbe says, therefore Yaakov got his reward. In other words, it's what was coming his way for having worked. Because the Alter Rebbe doesn't distinguish this into two categories: avodah stam and avodah b'chol koichai, doing your job and then doing your job fully. Because the Alter Rebbe's perspective is that being fully invested in your work, that is what it means to work. And therefore the reward for throwing yourself completely into your work is part of the schar of work. Not al schar roi, you get your reward. This has a beautiful lesson for us. In fact, it's quite a hectic lesson for us. We are all workers who are all working for the boss of all bosses. We're all here responsible to do the Eibishter's jobs, and that he expects of us. So then, if that's the context, if we're supposed to be working for the Eibishter, it's quite interesting that we should learn the parameters of what it means to be a truly dedicated worker, dafka from Yaakov in Choron. Is that far? The reason is the type of work that we're supposed to do with absolute dedication for the Eibishter is very much like the kind of work that Yaakov had to do at that point in his life. It's well known. It's pretty obvious that when Yaakov Avinu was in Lavan's home, he certainly was not doing the kind of avodah that he did in the yeshiva of Shem and Eber. He wasn't even doing the kind of avodah that he did back home with Yitzchak Avinu in Eretz Yisrael in a holy environment. In both of those scenarios, at home with Yitzchak or in yeshiva Shem Eber, all his avodas Hashem was in the cocoon of kedusha. No, but here we're describing Yaakov Avinu's avodah in Choron, which is not a nice place. The name Choron encapsulates the fact that this is a place that angers the Eibishter. And why is he there? He's there to make the world into the Eibishter's home. And that's very much what every single one of us has to do as the Eibishter's worker. Das, was an Neshama dient am Eibishter, wenn sie es noch in Olam Hasalyonim, the fact that our Neshama serves the Eibishter when it is in those higher realms before it comes into this life. Sie kommt in Olam Hazeh und tut sich an in Aguf before entering this world and the human body. Now, when Amati lefana, but when, as the pasuk says, I stood in front of the Eibishter, it's a highly advanced, very spiritual kind of avodas Hashem. Science, seichel, verstanden, Göttlichkeit, both intellectually, because you have this incredible intellectual appreciation of the Eibishter, and science midas, and you have overwhelmingly powerful sentiment towards the Eibishter. Ir avas Hashem, v'hiras Hashem, love and fear of the Eibishter. Aber das salz ir avoda. But that's all the avoda of the neshama. It's not yet necessarily the Eibishter's avoda. When the neshama comes up in Olam Hazeh Gashmi, specifically when the neshama enters our physical world, and dort gufa bleibt nicht der Adem verschlossen damit neu in die Daladamische Torah Tefillah. And in this world, the person doesn't stay locked away only in the safe space of davening and learning. But we engage with refining the world to take the lowest of the lowest of the low and turn it into the Eibishter's home. Da is Apel Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Then you're the Eibishter's worker. This is not self-serving. Das Melachta Shabbat Abbas. You're doing the work of your employer. Und auf dem ist die Name von Yaakov. And that's when Yaakov teaches us how to do it. Just like Yaakov Avinu in a foreign and, shall we even say, hostile environment, served not just going through the motions of his job, but with everything he had, which isn't just watching the clock, making sure that he's not cutting off time. Because if you do waste a bit of time here or there, person could say, look, it's not a terrible thing if here and there I do something which is self-serving, which fills my cup. As people like to say, even if filling my cup means to enjoy the process of me learning Torah. The Rambam and the Alter Rebbe both say a little bit here, a little bit there, before you know it, the whole day has gone by in a dishonest way. Hayom, the day is Hayom Laseisam, the day that we're here on earth, that we have a requirement to do what the Eibishter wants. The whole thing could escape us because we're doing a little bit here, a little bit there. So not only do we have to do the job, but we have to do it with every capacity of our neshama. And a person could think, listen, is noch in die Daladamische Torah Tefillah. As long as I'm in the holy space of davening and learning, then I could say, look, this is about me, how much I understand, my capacity. So I've got to invest my mind completely, because it's the world of Torah, and you need to exercise your mind to the extreme. And likewise with the attributes of personal sentiment and personal connection, which is primarily experienced during davening, where you daven not just saying the words and not just feeling gratitude and asking the Eibishter for what you want, but feeling a palpable love and fear of the Eibishter. But the person will say, that's when I'm in a holy environment. I've got to be fully invested. I've got to be heart and soul in what I'm doing. But now I'm going out into the world. And here the work is transform the world into a divine home. Surely the most important thing is just do it. And the avodah is verbunden mit Kabbalah Seil, Sheben Nefesh. And this is an avodah which is just accept what the Eibishter wants, carry the load, go ahead and do it. That Yaakov Avinu teaches us when it comes to this job of transforming the world into Hashem's home, that you've got to do b'chol koicha with every bit of your being. Not only with the more superficial aspects of self, which is going through the actions, but with the much deeper, more personal attributes. Your intellect, your midas, even the most elevated and abstract elements of a person have to be invested. This has to be what I want. This has to be what gives me pleasure. So you'll say, okay, but that's higher grade. That's the ideal form. Surely to get the job done of making the world Hashem's home, you just got to do what you got to do. The melacha, not the kol koichi. So then, looking particularly from the Alter Rebbe's perspective, that is the lesson. It's equally a chiyuv. Was on them, he says, gezel bitvalachtisha balabayis. Without that full investment, I'm actually stealing from the balabayis, in this case, from the Eibishter. In order to qualify as doing the work of making Hashem's home on earth, so doing the job, you could do it just by doing the job. But if you want it to be the job of your employer, in other words, the Eibishter's dira, not just me doing things, to get there, I have to throw myself in completely. A Yid has to feel in every fiber of his being that his whole purpose is to fulfill that shlichus, to make the Eibishter's home on earth. And as a worker, I am actually in the jurisdiction, even under the ownership of the balabos, the Eibishter's ownership. And therefore, I've got to give everything to fulfill the Eibishter's job. When a Yid invests in his avoida, in doing what the Eibishter wants with every bit of his soul, you get reward not only in some future experience in Gan Eden, but here on earth. Even to the extent that you have explosive success. Twice ma'oid, which is essentially ma'oid multiplied by ma'oid. Bli gvul amiti, truly unlimited achievement. Because specifically by engaging the Eibishter's work here on earth in the physical reality, does a person access the ultimate ma'oid, which is the completely unlimited bracha, and in Hashem, the gilui of that bracha with Mashiach now.